Okay, we're jumping all the way back to chapter 7, um, bone tissue, right? So this is a fairly brief chapter. So we just have this and muscle. Muscle is a much longer chapter. So we should be able to do this, I think, in one video lecture. Okay, bone, two types, compact and spongy. Compact is usually well, the kind of bone you saw in the microscope when we did tissue. It's usually on the outside on the long parts of bone called the diaphysis. It's also on the outside of bone, and spongy bone is either on the inside of bone or in the what's called the epiphysis, the ends of bone. Okay. Cartilage, we'll tell you a little bit about cartilage too. Mostly hyaline cartilage and fibrocartilage. And then we'll talk about ligaments and tendons. So we're looking at connective tissue, a bone with a solid matrix, cartilage with a rubbery, semi-solid matrix, and ligaments and tendon, that's irregular fibrous tissue. Irregular fibrous tissue. Okay. Now we usually think of bone as sort of like this inert stuff. It just sits there and it's like the scaffolding that we hang organs and muscles on. But actually, it's nothing farther from the truth. I mean, it's a really metabolically active tissue. It's extremely vascular. It's got blood running all through it, and it's really metabolically active, like I said, and it's constantly changing depending upon the stresses you put on it or don't put on it. So here's his functions. Obviously, it functions as support, right? Blood cell formation. That's where blood cells are made. All blood cells are made in red bone marrow. Calcium homeostasis and phosphate homeostasis, because as calcium phosphate salts, your skeleton is a huge reservoir for calcium, which is a really important ion. And so, and most it's regulated by hormones. Are going to get into those hormones. Movement, it allows movement, right? Muscles are attached to the bone, and we can move these parts of the skeleton with muscles. Protection, I mean, it protects vital organs. I mean, we have the sternum and ribs that protect lungs and heart, and the cranium protects your brain. And then there's a little bit about acid-base balance, because particularly with phosphate, is calcium phosphate. Phosphate is a big buffer, and it can really affect the how much your blood pH changes by how much phosphate is in it. So it has a little bit about acid-base balance, not too much, a little bit. Okay, so it's a connective tissue with a solid matrix made of collagen. Now, collagen is a fibrous protein, the most common protein I think in your body. It's a structural protein. And these long fibrous proteins are mineralized with a mixture of a calcium phosphate salt called hydroxyapatite. And we can see it's what's called a composite structure. Okay, shapes of bones. We got long bones, like bones in the extremities. We got short bones in the wrists and ankles, flat bones in the skull, and irregular bones that are really oddly shaped. Some skull bones are like really oddly shaped, like the sphenoid bone. And vertebrae are pretty oddly shaped as well, or irregularly shaped. And there they are right there. So long bones like the femur in your leg, short bone, a tarsal bone in your ankle, flat bones in your skull, and irregular bones of vertebra. So compact bone, spongy bone, we're going to get to those. That's called diplo. Sometimes in the flat bones in your skull, there's compact bone on the outside, and then the diplo is the very inside of bone, and that's spongy. And spongy has got all these spicules, and like arms that have big spaces between them. while spongy bone has these nice haversian systems that have a central vein and has these lamellae that are rounded. What you see under the microscope, if you look at bone, usually, in a tissue lab, we looked at spongy bone under the microscope. I mean, compact bone, not spongy. Diaphysis and epiphysis. So diaphysis is the middle of the long bone. Epiphysis are the ends of long bones. Articular cartilages. The ends of bone are coated in cartilage. Articular because it forms joints. Now some joints, like I say, that's extra credit, but some joints have fiber between, some have cartilage between. All of the freely movable joints that we usually think of as joints are the bones that make up that joint are lined with cartilage. It's a nutrient foramen that allows blood vessels to go into bone and provide blood for bone and nutrients and oxygen and take away waste products. Periosteum and endosteum. Periosteum is dense, irregularly connected tissue on the outside of bone. Endosteum is I think, dense, irregular on the inside, lining bone. And then the epiphyseal plates. We'll talk about those that are cartilage plates that allow you to grow taller, that exist as cartilage when you're young and adolescent and growing up, and they fuse at puberty, and then they ossify at puberty, and then you don't get any taller. Okay, we're going to look at bone cells in a little bit. There's several different types of bone cells that we're going to talk about in a little bit in a later slide. Okay, so there's the diaphysis here. Here's the nutrient foramen right there. There's the periosteum. There's the endosteum on the inside. Here's the bone marrow in here. This is usually yellow marrow in the diaphysis, which is just fat. And then there's red bone marrow in the epiphysis. They also have this metaphysis, but we don't really use that. So epiphysis, spongy bone, and then there's articular cartilage on the outside of the bone and on the ends of the bone. And then here is some compact bone here with these lamellae with osteocytes in lacunae, which are spaces within the bone. And then we don't need to know the different layers of the periosteum. Here's the endosteum here and this is spongy bone with osteocytes, and it has also cells that are called osteoclasts. They're multinucleate cells that break down bone. So we're going to talk about those in a moment. And osteoprogenitor cells, which are cells that haven't made up their mind what kind of bone cells they're going to be. Right? So compact bone, a haversian system is a central vein with these lamellae around it, and all these bone cells and lacunae in these layers around it. Spongy bone has spicules and trabeculae, these lines that go all over the place with big spaces between them. Bone marrow, remember, red blood cell formation in the epiphyses. Yellow is just fat in the diaphysis. So you have osteoprogenitor cells that are really could become any other type of any of the other types of cells. Then you have osteoblasts, which lay down osteoid, which is bone material, and they are immature cells that come from osteoprogenitor, and they are destined to become osteocytes when they grow up and they lay down bone and they encase themselves in this lacunae, and by laying on this osteoid, and they become osteocytes. And the osteoclasts are, like I said, really unusual cells. They're big multi-nucleate cells, And what they do is they chew up bone. They're generally on the inside of bones, on the endosteum, and they chew up bone. They destroy bone. So osteoblasts lay down bone and become osteocytes. Osteoclasts take away bone. So this is called bone remodeling. You're always changing, laying down bone and taking away bone depending upon the stresses you put on your bone, and also what your calcium homeostasis is. If you need, if you're low on calcium, you're going to be stimulating osteoclasts to break down bone and supply calcium to your blood. If you got too much calcium, you stimulate osteoblasts, and they'll lay down bone and take the calcium out of your blood. So bone is a composite. It's a combination tissue of a ceramic and a polymer. So here's the two things you need. You need it to be really hard, all right? And that's the ceramic part. But and so the ceramic is hydroxyapatite. But you also want it to be flexible. You want it to bend a little bit, you know, not too much, a little bit. And that's where the collagen comes in. So like airplane fuselages are made of composite material. They have to be really, really hard, but not brittle. You know, regular ceramic is really brittle. You drop it on the floor and it breaks. It breaks. If it's a composite and it's got it can flex. It's flexible as well as very hard. That's the composite. So, and there are proteoglycans and glycoproteins inside bone also. And all these things are proteins that have sugar moieties on them, sugar molecules. And either a proteoglycan has a lot of sugar and not that much protein. Glycoproteins are mostly protein and have sugar molecules attached to them. Oh, okay, so here's the osteoprogenitor cells. Appear developing the osteoblast. Osteoblasts lay down bone matrix and become osteocytes. Over here are the osteoclasts right here. Fusing bone marrow cells become these big, like I said, multinucleate cells that break bone down. So there's bone tissue right here with osteoclast, osteoblast, and osteocytes. So formation and resorption. So formation is laying down bone. Resorption is breaking down bone. So you form it by calcification or mineralization. So something called solubility product. Correct concentration of calcium and phosphate to form hydroxyapatite. So this is why, as a matter of fact, calcium is always more concentrated outside of cells than inside. And phosphate is always more concentrated inside cells than outside. Because if you put too much calcium phosphate together, you reach solubility product and you'll start laying down bone. And you don't want to lay down bone where you don't need bone. It's a very rare condition. I think it's called where when you get injured, your body responds not by scar tissue, but by laying down bone. So you don't want to have solubility product where you, so you got to keep calcium and phosphate separate until you want to lay down bone. And then of course the osteoblasts let calcium come in, forming hydroxyapatite and start laying down bone. There's other salts incorporated, sodium, magnesium sulfate, fluoride, and needs vitamin D and C. Actually needs C to make collagen, as a matter of fact. And you need D to help lay down bone. So those two vitamins are needed. Resorption, bone matrix destroyed by proteoenzymes and HCl by osteoclasts. And how do you, and how is it decided? It's the stresses you put on your bones. You put a lot of stress on your bones, you will lay down bone and make those bones stronger. You don't put stress on those bones, you will resorb those bones and those bones will become much weaker. This is what happened to Astronauts, they go into space. It's there's no gravity. Their bones aren't stressed and used to come back to Earth with a loss of a lot of bone and muscle also. Remember, those cosmonauts used to be sitting in these beanbag chairs after they come back because they've been 200 something days in orbit, and their bones are so weak if they try to stand up, they're going to break them. So this is why, like on the space station, when they bring up exercise equipment to make sure that the astronauts exercise while they're up there, so they don't lose too much bone while they're up there. Okay, hyaline cartilage. Make sure it doesn't have calcium. High percentage of water. Chondroblast is this cell that lays down cartilage, and it becomes chondrocyte. And they are also in lacunae inside hyaline cartilage. They're covered by a perichondrium. Now that is a layer of dense irregular that covers cartilage. It's the perichondrium. And it's avascular. No nerves in cartilage, and it's avascular. That is, there's no blood vessels. That's why cartilage heals really slowly, because it's avascular. Cartilage growth is interstitial and appositional. Interstitial, that's true for bone also. Interstitial is growing taller this way. Appositional is growing sideways. So once you're beyond puberty, you don't have any more interstitial growth. You can have appositional growth, make bones stronger or weaker. So bone development, ossification and osteogenesis, two types, intramembranous, endochondrial. Endochondrial is from hyaline cartilage. Intramembranous, I think, is from what's that? From fetal cancer tissue. Most bones are endochondrial. They start off as hyaline cartilage and they become bones. There's a few bones that are intramembranous. I think most of the flat bones of your skull are intramembranous. I think your clavicle is intramembranous. And most other bones are endochondrial. Mesenchyme. So intramembranous comes from mesenchyme, and endochondria comes from hyaline cartilage. So like I said, bone growth and remodeling, bone elongation, interstitial growth. You grow longer bones. Bone widening and thickening is appositional bone. So you grow a thicker bone. Right? And bone remodeling is called Wolff's Law. And that's what I just mentioned. The strength of your bones is determined by how much stress you put on them. You exercise, you're putting stress on bones, you end up with stronger bones. You're a couch potato, you don't do much exercise, your bones are going to get weaker. So there's, this is intramembranous, mesenchyme, thickening areas of mesenchyme. Like I said, the flat bones of the skull are intramembranous. And osteo undergoes calcification, woven bone and surrounding periosteum form, and the lamellar bone replaces woven bone. And like I said, this is in intramembranous in the flat bones of the skull, and clavicle also. But then endochondrial is starting with hyaline cartilage as your fetus, like your arm bone, fetal hyaline cartilage, and an ossification center starts in the middle of the bone in the diaphysis, and then there are secondary ossification centers. So primary in the diaphysis and then secondary ones in the epiphysis. So you end up with bone being made on the inside of bone, on the long axis of bone, bone being made, so that bone heads out from the center, and then there's secondary ossification centers in the epiphyses, and that sends bone making in this direction. All right, and we have cartilage between them. So you have the ossification center in the diaphysis, the two ossification centers in the epiphyses, and you have cartilage between them. Okay, And that cartilage becomes the epiphyseal plates right here and right here when you're an adolescent. So those stay as cartilage, and they, on the edges of the epiphyseal plate, lays down bone, and you're able to grow taller and taller. But eventually, after puberty, under the influence of sex hormones really cause bone to be laid down quickly, and mitosis in the epiphyseal plate. But eventually, the ossification catches up, so you're making new hyaline cartilage in the epiphyseal plate. But then on the edges, you're laying down bone, and after a while, the bone making catches up to the cartilage making and overwhelms the cartilage making and turns the epiphyseal plates into bone. And then they become an epiphyseal line, and you are not getting any taller. That's it, right? Once that happens. But here is appositional growth. How you have an infant, child, young adult, you're getting larger, thicker and larger bones this direction. So what happens is bone is laid down on the outside by osteoblasts. Bone is chewed up on the inside by osteoclasts. And so bone deposited by osteoblasts on the outside, bone resorbed by osteoclasts on the inside. So you end up with a greater and greater circumference of bone on the outside and a larger and larger bone marrow space on the inside until you reach your adult life. And it may slow down a little bit, but it's still going to be remodeled even in adult life. You may lay down bone or break down bone depending upon the stress, Wolff's law again. So, solubility product. You can't let a lot of calcium and phosphorus build up in an area where you don't want to make bone. That's called ectopic ossification. And that would make a bone where you shouldn't make it. And there's one condition, I should have looked it up, it's a really rare condition where you, whenever you injure yourself, instead of repairing the tissues with the tissues that were injured, you make bone. And so, and of course, we have little injuries all across our life, and these people end up being human statues because they become ossified through their entire body. It's a bad genetic disease. Okay. Mineral resorption acid phosphatase. So depositing, laying down bone, getting to solubility product. Mineral resorption is acid phosphatase, acid dissolving bone, what osteoclasts do. Okay, as I said, dependent upon the stress put on bone, detected by osteocytes. The stress, how they detect the stress, I don't know. And osteopenia is a natural loss of bone with aging. When we get to the muscle chapter, we'll find there's also something called sarcopenia, where natural loss of muscle with aging as well. All right, influence of hormone growth stimulates somatostatin from liver and insulin-derived growth factor from liver, and you start laying down bone. So growth stimulates bone growth. Thyroid hormone increases metabolism. If you're going to lay down bone, you got to stimulate your metabolism. Sex hormones, they really stimulate the laying down of bone, but also lead to the end of growth because they're the ones that really cause the closing of the epiphyseal plates. Glucocorticoids inhibit growth. Serotonin inhibits growth. So calcium homeostasis, and one of the major things bone tissue does is calcium homeostasis. Calcium exchange between plasma and bone. So there's exchangeable and interchangeable and inexchangeable calcium. So hypocalcemia is too low of calcium in your blood, and that leads to hyperexcitability of nerve cells. But hypercalcemia, that's too much calcium in the blood, leads to hypoexcitability, turns down the excitability of nerve cells. We're having too little calcium, turns up nerve cells. And that really doesn't happen that often because, it's really hard to get too low on calcium because you've got this huge reservoir of calcium in your bones. And if your calcium gets too low, you will take it from your skeleton and your skeleton will weaken. And if your calcium is too high, then you can lay down bone and take it out of your blood by osteoblasts. So, as I said, calcium homeostasis run by hormones. Calcitriol, vitamin D derivative, raises blood calcium by actions on small intestine, kidneys, and skeleton. So actually you cannot really take in too much calcium because you need vitamin D to absorb it from the small intestine, and you can limit how much you can gain from the small intestine, limit how much you excrete in kidneys, and how much you take from the skeleton. Calcitonin from thyroid gland lowers blood calcium by inhibiting osteoclasts and stimulating osteoblasts. It's thought that that hormone doesn't work too much in adults, but it's still there. Parathyroid hormone from the thyroid gland raises blood calcium by its effects on the skeleton and the kidneys. All right, so it'll stimulate osteoclasts and stimulate reabsorption of calcium from the kidneys. Phosphate homeostasis is not as critical, but it goes in the opposite direction from calcium. It's raised by calcitriol, lowered by PTH. So PTH raises blood calcium, it lowers blood phosphate. Calcitriol lowers blood calcium, raises blood phosphate. So they go in opposite directions. Just like aldosterone sends sodium and potassium in opposite directions. It stimulates the absorption of sodium and causes the excretion of potassium. If it's low, more calcium is lost and more potassium is brought in. Okay, bone disorders. I like to get into bone disorders and fractures. There's all different kinds of fractures. I'm not going to get into that. But there is the healing of fractures, hematoma and granulation tissue. You form this blood hematoma at the site where the bone has been broken. You have this soft callus that's really like cartilage forming, and then a hard callus of that cartilage ossifying, and then you remodel it and you put it in, and it ends up coming back good as new if it's set properly. Okay, and that is close and open. Close is you break a bone and it stays inside your body. Open fractures when the bone actually breaks the surface of the skin. That's a little more dangerous. Those are much worse fractures. Osteoporosis, this is something, a loss of bone tissue with age, can happen in both genders, but it's more common in women because estrogen inhibits osteoclasts. And therefore, after menopause, women's estrogen level goes way down, and therefore osteoclasts get carried away, and they start breaking down more bone than they should. So a lot of older women get estrogen supplements to try to prevent that. And that's it. So that's it. As I said, this is a pretty short chapter. So this will be 203bone1, and this is the only one we need for bone. So I'll catch you next time when we do muscle. So see you later for now.